If only we could send that book to members of the Supreme Court. So it's Labor Day weekend, that special secular holiday that somehow ends up wrapped in the American flag like so many others. It is the weekend for furniture sales, end of the model year closeout sales at car dealerships, and the weekend in which college students return to dormitories all across the country to settle in for the season, every bit as regular as the swallows that return each year to Capistrano. In Boston, this is known as Alston Christmas, when the moving in and out of college students leaves a plethora of furniture and weirdness on the curb, and one must be advised to carefully sniff before you bring that gift into your house. It is also the time of being storrowed, which means the parents typically of engineering students bound for MIT will try to drive the U-Haul truck on Storrow Drive, which is beset by a variety of low bridges, which then storrows or tries to take the top off the moving van. It is the unofficial end of summer, the weekend when my grandmother would pack away her white purse and shoes and take out the black set that she would wear until Easter the following year. It is the last weekend to wear seersucker, hence my spiffy seersucker robe, as well, according to traditional fashion rules. My grandmother would be very, very confused to see me in a pulpit, but probably proud. The academic and agricultural calendars mark this time of the year as one of anticipation, beginnings and endings, and much, much, much work. And work is a thing worth considering on Labor Day. There's been a lot of noise lately about the culture of tipping. During the pandemic, some of the hardest hit employees were those who worked in places to serve food to the public, restaurants, coffee houses, and the like. Tipping, particularly via electronic purchasing, started as a way to help make up the difference in lost wages for servers, but now seems to be ubiquitous, and people are expressing frustration. Cannot we simply order a sandwich at Subway and get it to go without being asked for a tip by the computer or app on my phone? When did tipping sandwich artists become a thing? William Scott, the author of our reading today, railed against the psychology, morality, politics, and economy of tipping culture back in 1916. But not much of what he described has changed in the century since he put pen to page. Certainly there are no more porters at the barbershop, and department stores no longer buy or sell pianos. But the underlying culture of tipping remains. In a recent broadcast on National Public Radio's It's Been a Minute, host Brittany Luce spoke with historian and NPR podcaster Ramtin Arablawe about the history of tipping culture in the US. It was Arablawe who cited William Scott's book from which I excerpted today's reading. Arablawe had much to say about tipping culture and its origins, which are rooted in European nobility. In the age of nobility, tipping was a thing done to servants as a way to show appreciation for goods or services provided. There were complex social rules about tipping other people's servants, don't, and one's own, only sometimes, or those who were in service in the public marketplace, such as merchants, artisans, or workers at inns, restaurants, or brothels. In those places, a customer paid the house fee for whatever was being purchased, and the noble might offer the individual provider an additional gratuity as appreciation for exemplary performance or attention. Now, Scott argues that tipping culture is utterly incompatible with a Republican democracy, in which each individual is declared to be equal, at least when it comes to voting or purchasing goods. It did not escape me when I read that this book was written in 1916 that half of the population was forbidden at that time from voting. But never mind. Many Americans, though, chafe at the notion that the bootblack or garbage collector is a moral and political equal to them in every way. Class issues mix with the human instinct to construct a hierarchy, a pecking order of importance, and to find one's own place in it. By doing so, there are naturally people above us and people below us, and how we treat those in either direction says a lot about who we are. Tipping allows us to purchase a fantasy of superiority, Arabuli says. It allows a customer to behave in a way that feels as though they have servants of whom they can demand a particular level of, well, servitude. If a server is particularly attentive or differential, providing above and beyond the expected standard of service, then the customer can reward that server with additional cash and reward themselves with the illusion of generosity, when what they are doing is something far less altruistic. Scott described it thusly: where all men are equals, some cannot become superior unless others grovel in the dust. Tipping comes into a democracy to produce that relation. Tipping is the price of pride. It is what one American is willing to pay to induce another American to acknowledge inferiority. That's a big mouthful, isn't it? It represents, he writes, it represents the root of aristocracy, budding anew in the hearts of those who publicly renounce the system and all its works. William Scott was ultimately a man of his time. When he wrote this volume in 1916, women's suffrage had not yet been passed through Congress. His language is steeped in the patriarchy and white supremacist culture of the early 20th century. He tended to view the issue of tipping with the sense of outrage typical of a man who feels entitled to a certain degree of service without having to pay extra for it. His argument that merchants and hoteliers pay their staff decently and forbid tipping so that the customer can be sure of a real price and a real level of service seems as much a defense of his own sense of entitlement as sound economic, ethical, and political policy. He rarely bases his argument in terms of the exploitation of workers who must function in a tipping society. He is able to focus briefly on the moral abdication of business owners who enjoy the ability to pay less in wages to tipped workers, putting the responsibility of a living wage onto the customer who has already paid for his meal or his hotel room. Nowhere does he examine the flaws of capitalism that prioritize profit over the dignity of employees. Business owners overall seek to pay the bare minimum that they can for materials and staff necessary for their business, and to charge as high a price as the market will bear in the public marketplace. He views those who work in a tipping culture as intentional extortionists and not those who must hustle for every penny. Nowhere does he examine the economic system that relies upon exploitation and greed as the skeleton upon which all those muscles rely. So I've said quite a bit about tipping culture and history without saying a whole lot about what we might be able to do about it. Now, we can acknowledge that it is wrong, but if we refuse to participate in the system, we either stiff the wait staff when we go out, or we never go outside to dine. Neither of those options is realistic, frankly, or attractive in our present world. What I'd like to think about then is the justice and exploitation part of this thing. Certainly, we can work toward legislative changes regarding wages and tipping and all the rest, but in our daily lives, we can do other things to make sure that the people who work in tipped industries are not exploited, at least by us. Okay? What might be a manageable thing that we can do to ease the exploitation of the servers that we come in contact with? To begin this effort, we need to know some basic facts about wages and tips and the rest. Does anyone know the minimum hourly wage for work in the United States? Yes. Right. That's not correct. What is the minimum wage in Pennsylvania? That's right. $7.25 an hour. Now, various states have instituted higher minimum wage policies, but in some places, that's still the baseline. Pennsylvania, it's still $7.25, but with a one-vote margin in the House, the Pennsylvania legislature passed a resolution that will bring that minimum wage up to $11 per hour beginning in 2024, and it will increase again annually until it hits $15 in 2026. That would be encouraging if it didn't require at least $18 in change per hour for a person to afford an apartment. The minimum hourly wage for people in tipped jobs nationally is what? $3? No. Yep. $2.13 nationally. $2.13 an hour is what your waitress, well, no, here in Pennsylvania, it's $2.83 for tipped workers. Right. So your waitress at Denny's, who's on a 10-hour shift, brings home $28.30 in wages at the end of the hour. Anything else she makes is dependent entirely upon the mood of the people at her tables. Now, it's possible that she could make more than $100 or even $150 in tips in a day, but it's also possible that she only makes $30. Depends on the crowds, and it depends on how they're feeling. In the United States, we judge a person's value, because we do, let's not pretend we don't, as a human being in accordance with what value we place on their job. Are they a contributing member of society? Do they do something important or something maybe less? When we meet somebody, the first thing we ask is what? Like, what's your name? Where you from? What do you do? What do you do for work? Because that is important. Now think of how people sometimes treat wait staff in a restaurant. No other employees in the United States depend so heavily upon the goodwill of the people they serve for their very livelihood. And just so we're clear here, do not think for a moment that waiting tables is untrained work. Has anyone here waited tables? Is it untrained work? Yeah, no, exactly, right? It is complicated and fast-paced and physically challenging, and it requires the servers to remain calm, polite, and deferential at all times, even when cutting people off from having more to drink, or they risk getting stiffed. The standard practice in restaurants is for the wait staff to split their tips with other folks at the restaurant on that shift. So the waitress may have to share a portion of her tips with, and I'm using the feminine here, because overwhelmingly, this tipped work is done by women in our culture, and it is paid less specifically because of that, okay? Women and people of color overwhelmingly are in the tipped industries. So the waitress has to share a portion of her tips with the cook, the maitre d', the dishwasher, the busboy, and depending on the place, the bartender as well. I worked for one season, as a line cook at a shabby chic restaurant in Bar Harbor. It was the kind of place where the antique dishes didn't match because that was a thing, and where a 6-ounce portion of salmon cost $28 and 5 scallops on some Uncle Brown's brown rice with a side of mashed sweet potatoes cost $30. The restaurant's signature dish, a lobster strudel, went for somewhere over $30, but I don't remember how much. I know I made $8 an hour as a cook. And the wait staff tipped me 10% of their tips on anything they made over $50. So if they made $55 one night in tips, my share of that was 50 cents. That was in 2006, I think. I would get home at midnight or later, exhausted and smelling of fried fish, and sometimes with a pocket full of ones from the tips. And I took home somewhere between $250 and $300 a week on a good week. Patriarchy and colonialism are the waters that feed the very roots of American capitalism. Indeed, as Angela Davis taught us, racism, this is Angela speaking, quote, racism in the first place is a weapon used by the wealthy to increase the profits they bring in by paying Black workers less for their work. We devalue the work done by those whose humanity we choose to see as less than 100% valuable, and vice versa. I could say the same of the cost of ministry. It used to be that ministers were all male, and as such, their salaries were dollar for dollar, year for year, significantly higher than they are now, particularly in Unitarian Universalism ministry, which is now largely 3/4 led by female ministers. As a culture, we pay the absolute least amount of money for the hardest, most miserable or demeaning tasks. Why is that? One would think we'd want to pay high wages to get people to do unpleasant things. But we do not value people whose jobs we do not want to do. Our worth as people is bound up in a toxic way with what we do for work. And this is where we get into the concept of the deserving poor, right? Do we believe that a sanitation worker deserves a living wage? And what kind of living wage? Enough for a small apartment somewhere in the city, or enough for a house in the suburbs where you can raise a family? What about a cocktail waitress? Those cocktail waitresses work hard. Breakfast waitress. Nobody hustles like a breakfast waitress. A kindergarten teacher, right? They hold our most precious, precious bits of our family. And they get paid less than your car mechanic. What about a nurse's aide? Sex worker, retail clerk, pizza delivery person, a dancer in a club, a worker in a fast food burger joint, or a Walmart greeter. Walmart greeters, Walmart employees, period, are coached when they join the staff. They're given a list of resources available that includes food stamps, because they will not make enough money at Walmart to have a living wage, and they will qualify for food stamps working full-time, or what passes for full-time at Walmart. So this week, I want you to think about eating in a restaurant. And this may screw up your Sunday afternoon. I want you to think about what your meal would cost if your waiter was paid a living wage instead of relying on tips. Keep in mind that some people tip 15%, some 20, some only 10, and others leave no tip at all. Keep in mind also that the server shares their tips with the cook, the busboy, bartender, and dishwasher. What would it cost for your meal if each of those people received a living wage and had health insurance? So I bet it would cost half again to double the price charged on your meal. Now here's the thing. By participating in this, by going out and eating a meal, let's say it costs $20, and you leave a $4 tip. If everybody in that place were getting a living wage and insurance, and I think there's a part of us that would gladly do it to pay $40 or $50 for that meal, knowing that the people there have a living wage, that they don't have to work 3 jobs. So the fact that we're getting it for $20 means that somewhere along the line, someone's being exploited. Okay? And now that makes us complicit, which is the uncomfortable part, right? If we do not pay what it would be really worth, then we are dining at the expense of the exploitation of workers in the restaurant. Now, it is not the fault of the wait staff that the system is set up the way it is. And so until that system is replaced with one that is just and equitable, we individually can practice justice and equity when we dine out. And if we can't financially afford to tip in a way that does not exploit people, then we must consider whether our souls can afford to participate in that. It's a tall order, I know, and I'm just screwing up all of your lunch plans. I know that. But like with any truth, once we see it, once we acknowledge it, once we acknowledge its realness, we cannot unsee it. We cannot unknow it. We cannot, again, simply tip 20% and think we are doing the right thing. I didn't just screw up your lunch plans. I screwed up eating at restaurants for you for the rest of your lives. But here's the thing. Like, who are we as people? What do we value? Dolores Huerta had people boycotting grapes for a long time. When I lived in California, I learned that Driscoll's Fruit is a strike-breaking organization. They do not hire union workers. And as much as I love strawberries, I can't buy Driscoll berries. Because once you've seen workers in the fields, I can't participate in that. Once you've seen the back of the house in a restaurant, it's really hard to participate in that and tip $4 on a $20 meal. And with that, I wish you a happy and thoughtful Labor Day weekend. And as ever, may our practice in our bodies, in our actions, in our world, reflect the prayer in our hearts and our commitment to justice and equity, today and always. Amen.